We can probably get started. Thank you guys for coming. This is the second in our speaker series focusing on the historic landscape. So, looking back at the time of the agency, also looking at the people of the landscape, the cultures, the physical surroundings into which this house was built, the geography. Tonight, looking at a time when a lot of change in the cultural landscape. So this speaker series has been possible in partnership with the Wisconsin Historical Society, and also through the support of the Wisconsin Humanities Council. And tonight we have a gentleman here, Dr. Stephen Kircher from the UW, who is a board member on the Humanities Council, who would like to say a couple words about what the Humanities Council does before we get started. So.
I'm Stephen Kircher, professor of history at UW-Oshkosh, and so I came here today from Menasha. It would have taken a few days to get here in the old way, right? But I live right on the water, and it's been a point of fascination for me to come down here. I've never been to Portage, and to see the Indian Agency House and the landscape that surrounds this property. And I'll say, I communicated this to Adam earlier, this is truly an exceptional place. How many of you are from the immediate area? Most of you? Okay. Anyone from further afield? Where from?
Platteville.
Platteville? You came all the way from Platteville?
Yep.
That's impressive. Anyone further than that?
Menasha, Wisconsin, right here.
Menasha.
Menasha, Oshkosh here.
Wonderful.
Madison.
So it's really great that you're drawing people from all over the state. I'm going to keep this very short. The reason I'm here is because I am a board member for Wisconsin Humanities, and as board members we go out and see the sites that have received grant funding, and the historic Indian Agency House has received several rounds of grant funding. This project is part of a recovery grant that Adam proposed about 2 years ago. All of our money comes from the federal government and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the state, Wisconsin Humanities is a local agency that helps support projects like this to put on very good programming. So it's really great to see that this money is being very well spent. It's not my money by any stretch, but I'm very impressed with what Adam is able to do, his interpretive skills and his creative ways of thinking about the relevance of the landscape. And also what's really notable, I think this is going on all over the state, is for traditional historic preservation sites and historical societies to partner with indigenous tribes and partner on interpretive enterprises like we see out here. So this is a really positive direction, and it's all very impressive. So again, thank you for doing what you do, and I'm hoping that the Wisconsin Humanities Council, we call ourselves Wisconsin Humanities now, for some reason we got rid of the council. I hope that we see future applications for funding in the future, because this is really impressive. Enjoy the evening.
Well, tonight, like I said, we're looking at some changes on the cultural landscape that focus around the lead district. And then we have Tracey Lee Roberts, who's a senior lecturer emeritus at UW-Platteville. We're in teaching history, also a lot of relevance to the lead district from that area. So really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Adam. All right. Thanks for coming out. It's nice to be here again. Very grateful to see what Adam's done. I concur with you. Been watching this space develop over the last 15 years or so when I first came here, and he's doing a fabulous job. So wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Let me just get some water here. That's all. All right. fit in the way you want it? All right, then I'm gonna start, if you're comfortable here. All right. All right, well, the old lead mine district of the upper Mississippi River Valley was a federally designated region. So this is a region the federal government actually set aside to be sure that there would be enough lead in order to make shot, bullets, to make ammunition for the multiple wars that were going on throughout the centuries. So that's one of the uses of lead. So this set-aside district included southwest Wisconsin. It included northern Illinois and northwestern Iowa, a vast region of much diversity. The lead district was centered in the cities of Galena, Illinois, Dubuque, Iowa, and the Wisconsin counties of Grant, Lafayette, and Iowa. The region is rich in natural beauty, I can tell you that, we lived there. And it straddles the Mississippi River, which along with the Fox, Wisconsin waterway was the highway into the area until train tracks were laid to Galena in 1854. The aftermath of the Blackhawk War of 1832 marks the final stage of Indian removal from the upper Mississippi lead mine district. The conflict and accommodation as well with white settlers in the area began long before that. The mineral district was a highly contested region between Native and European nations. One could point to various moments in history to detail the struggles for dominance in the lead mine region. But first we need to understand the zeitgeist or underlying cultural thinking related to the so-called Age of Discovery. While Americans often point to the theory of manifest destiny, the concept that white Western expansion was inevitable and ordained by God, that was the driving force westward. Actually, that concept was not articulated until 1845. The legal right underlying the belief that white Europeans had the right to take, occupy, and exploit land and resources anywhere in the world goes back to the late 15th century. That's the lead mine district in red. There's also a zinc district. We're not going to talk about that. Zinc was mined and processed much later date than the date that we're talking about tonight. So the papal bull, Inter Caetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, actually gave the legal and moral weight to a clearly immoral and preposterous notion. The bull stated that land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by European Christian rulers. This doctrine of discovery became the basis of European land claims in the Americas, as well as the foundation for later United States expansion. And this is one of those romantic paintings from the late 1800s that were so popular for our children's school books and for us to ponder the leaving of the shore of the great European nations and going off into the unknown, to the Americas. So I enjoy these graphic descriptions so we kind of understand where people are coming from at different periods. So that's from the late 1800s. Of course, the grand, with this rationale, this Age of Discovery and the right of discovery, France claimed the lands of Nouvelle-France in the 16th century. Desiring to expand their American holdings, permission was given by the French king to René Robert Cavalier Serre de la Salle, a French explorer, entrepreneur, and fur trader, to explore and claim lands in La Louisiane Française, so the Louisiana Territory. After about 20 years of travel in 1682, La Salle claimed a huge swath of land for Louis XIV. Not actually knowing the extent of his discovery, the Louisiana Territory claim included all of the regions watered by the Mississippi River and its tributaries. That's a huge swath of land that's marked for you in green on this map. Of course, the grand plans discussed and the proclamations made and the hallowed halls of Rome or at the courts in Paris, London, or Madrid are one thing. Actually traversing vast regions of varied landscape with undulating topography, rivers, streams, marshes, swamps, and bogs is quite another thing. There are an estimated 1 million Native Americans occupying the lands which became the Louisiana Territory. As late as 1763, there are only about 20,000 people from Europe and African descent in that same region. French conquest of the entire territory that they claimed was certainly not inevitable, and of course was not realized during their regime. La Salle and his trusted friend and fellow explorer Enrico Tanti traveled by horse, foot, wagon, and canoe in all weather and terrain. In the memoir that La Salle and Tanti sent to the French king, they said of the Mississippi River Valley, "It could produce every year 20,000 écus worth of peltries, an abundance of lead, and wool for shipbuilding. If wheat will not grow at the lower part of the river, the upper country would furnish it, and the islands," I think here he means the Caribbean islands, which of course the French had Caribbean plantation slave islands at that time, "that the country could supply the islands with everything they need, such as planks, vegetables, grain, and salt beef." Prior to white migration to the area, there were many nations occupying the lead mine district lands, at least seasonally. The Ho-Chunk, or Winnebago as they were called in the early literature, have long roots in Wisconsin that go back over 1,000 years. They occupied territory in the Green Bay, Lake Winnebago area for generations, but eventually added villages in today's Lafayette and Iowa counties and down into northern Illinois. Some of the other nations moved into the southern driftless area during the mid-1700s as they were displaced by Europeans and powerful Indian confederacies in the east. These include the Muskogee, earlier known as the Fox, who claimed lands along both sides of the Mississippi River, the Sauk or Sac, allies of the Muskogee, who claimed lands from Rock Island, Illinois, and north of present-day Dubuque, Iowa, and Potawatomi, another Algonquin-speaking nation, who were moved to the western section of the old lead mine district. So hopefully this map gives you a little sense, and of course it's a bit vague. Ho-Chunk probably, it seems to me, retained in a slightly later period a lot more land than this map is showing. Muskogee certainly shrunk down very quickly, so this is a snapshot in time done by very responsible geographers, but I think it changed quickly. So when we see one thing from 1760, that doesn't mean it would look like that by 1800. So it's a very fluid kind of thing. It appears that molten lead was widely traded by the nations of the lead mine district. Fish hooks and sinkers, bale seals used to mark bundles of fur and other commodities, and even an anchor have been recovered from multiple sites. Archaeologists have found cast lead animal amulets made by Native Americans in the area of the lead mine district. They are often in the shape of the beaver or the turtle. There's evidence that they were using pounded, unsmelted lead pieces as ornaments on their vestments, and lead ore was ground to a powder for body colorant. Upper Mississippi lead has been found at sites all around the present United States. It was a hotly traded item. During this period, lead production appears to have been a seasonal business, probably conducted by women, old men, and boys. It was relatively small compared to the industrial mining that was soon to follow. That's my phone. Jeff, can you turn off my phone by chance? Sorry about that. Okay. There were a number of documented French, Canadian, and métis, along with some British and a few American fur traders, working with local nations in the district from the mid-1600s to the mid-1700s. In the 1680s, Frenchman Nicolas Perrot built a short-lived trading post at Prairie du Chien called Fort St. Nicholas. So this map has identified where that is on that point there. The area was a trading place for Sauk, Muskogee, Ho-Chunk, and Dakota peoples. Much of the early lead, as well as furs, was sold here. Despite the fact that the British won control of the area in 1763, they did little to develop the region. French-speaking Creoles began to reside permanently at Prairie du Chien in the 1770s. They traded metal tools, weapons, finished cloth, and ornaments for pelts, lead, and foodstuffs. This period was one of tremendous growth in population and active conflict over the sovereignty of the lead district. So we're talking here, you can see the map of Wisconsin is outlined for you, and Prairie du Chien is right here at the Wisconsin River. The lead district is really more like here. So it's the northern, I'd say, area, if you will, of the lead mine district. And of course, it was a hugely important trading center, Prairie du Chien. Miners and traders from Prairie du Chien traveled downriver and learned of the extensive Indian mines that were in the lead mine districts. So they're going down from here to about here. In 1788, on the west shore of the upper Mississippi, Julian Dubuque, a well-educated French-Canadian entrepreneur, established a productive fur trading and mining operation at today's Dubuque, Iowa. Dubuque had to receive permission from the Muskogee and Sauk to carry out his work. Despite the French genocide of their nation some 50 years before, the fur trading and lead mining economy allowed for individual and group interaction between French-speaking traders and the Muskogee. Dubuque and his men built cabins, a mill, black shops, smith's shop, and trading posts. He gathered a number of métis, that is, people of both French, usually, and Native American ancestry, and French-Canadian miners and traders. They centered their efforts at Catfish Creek, home of a Quoquah, or Kettle Chief, a Meskwaki leader, and at La Pointe, or Fever River settlement at present-day Galena, Illinois. So Dubuque's plan is really a fabulous document, and we're really lucky we have it. The reason we have it is because even though the Muskogee only lent Dubuque this property, he married into a Muskogee family, we'll get into that in a second. He was deeply in debt in St. Louis to the Choteaus, and maybe if you've done any history or research on St. Louis, you know that the Choteaus are credited, rightly or wrongly, with establishing St. Louis as an important fur trading center, and then later, of course, as a major city. So the Choteaus are saying, he owes us so much money that we need to take half of his land. So in this map, it says Antoine Choteau down here, Auguste Choteau right here, Monsieur, there he is, Auguste Choteau. And then this part was going to be some other claim. So we're looking at the Mississippi River coming along here. We're looking at Dubuque, Iowa. I don't know if you know where that is. Do you? I hope so. I know where Portage is. And so on this map, it shows you where the buildings are. So this is a really interesting map, and it's held by the State Historical Society of Missouri. Lucy Aldersveld Murphy, who's a really great historian in Ohio, she did a really cool study of this map and then all the documents that go with it, because it became a legal claim by the Choteaus against Dubuque's estate, and so you've got all this legal paperwork, right? You've got arguments and people going to court over this, and are they going to get the land? And this went on until the 1850s. Dubuque died in 1810, so it went on for decades. But so it means that we have this really cool map, and then historians who are sensitive to what this means can actually divine a whole lot of information that maybe on first glance doesn't mean that much, right? So I'm really interested in this map. Dubuque married at least once to a métis woman. So this is a woman of mixed ancestry, Native American and French. Her name was Josette Pelletier, called Antea, dit Antea, the daughter of Pierre Antea and probably Pokulsi, a Muskogee woman. Both of them were from Prairie du Chien. This marriage and reported numerous gifts to tribal leaders allowed Dubuque use of the land and its resources. The smelting furnace ensured a steady supply of lead to make into bullets, which were required for hunting for the furs and for food, and Dubuque's trading post ensured that needed goods could be produced. This was a relationship then with the Muskogee that had mutual benefits. Weirdly and wonderfully, bars of lead made in Dubuque's furnace were recovered, and I don't know by whom, but this is on the Dubuque History website, which is it's a book that they put online, Dubuque History, and these bars are there. I'm very excited about that. So this localized history going on at Dubuque's estate with Muskokees and métis and Frenchmen and Canadians, you know, all these folks coming together and creating this mix of cultures and peoples and trying to find accommodations for mutual benefit. That's all happening, but it's playing out in the context of massive geopolitical shifts. The 7 Years' War, which was violently fought in North America as the French and Indian War, ended in 1763, with the French losing much of its overseas colonies to Great Britain, including the eastern shore of the Mississippi River. The west side of the Mississippi River, however, was under Spanish control, and you can see that in the brown there. So that meant now that Dubuque's mines were in actually Spanish territory. So those laws and that jurisdiction had to be accepted. Dubuque wisely decided to call his operation the Mines of Spain. Right? Gotta make the French king, gotta make the Spanish king happy. Now, perhaps unbeknownst to his Muskogee friends and allies, in 1796, Dubuque chose to secure a land grant from the governor of New Spain for the 189 square miles of land he was occupying. He clearly saw the region as being under Spanish control, and he wanted to secure a legal claim, not just the agreement he had made with the Muskogee. He was deeply in debt, he owed money to power brokers in St. Louis, and he wanted to use his property deed as collateral to secure better terms on his debts. This period of native-white nexus saw accommodation from both sides. Marriages between Indian women and French men, trading and alliances in warfare against the British, then Americans, and other tribes brought the two cultures in constant close contact. The fur trading voyageur era, heavily dependent on Indian assistance and cooperation, increasingly concentrated its economic activity on lead production. This shift occurred just as the French regained Spain's possession of the Louisiana Territory in 1800. That was during the Napoleonic Wars. This was short-lived, however, because I know you know that in 1803, Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, right, from the French, from Napoleon. So this is why this is very complicated history, and I'm trying to make it work. And maybe you know all this history already, but it is a mix of peoples, and that's what I'm always amazed by, is how absolutely mixed this region was in not only Native American tribal and nation groups, but in major European nations as well. For most of a decade, very few whites were found in the lead district. In 1810, after his death, the creditors made their way up from St. Louis to make an inventory of Dubuque's holdings. That's the map you saw. And they attempted to claim half the land. This was hung up in the courts for a long time. In the meantime, the Muskogee burned down all of Dubuque's buildings so that they could be of no use to trespassers. In 1811, the notorious and wily John Smith T. Well, he lived in Missouri and he's from Tennessee. And he didn't like that his name was John Smith because there's a lot of John Smiths out there. So he added just a T at the end to stand for Tennessee. Don't you forget it. He was notorious because he was known to be a dueler, and he killed many men in duels. He and about 100 armed men from Missouri attempted to take over the large mines at Catfish Creek, at the very site that Dubuque's diggings were at. They were quickly turned back after having lost at least half of their men to death and injury. Native groups had learned the hard way that the aim of the Americans was to divest them of their lands. French and American traders were sequestered to islands in the Mississippi if they wanted to trade for lead, furs, and food. Whites were rarely shown the Indian mining operations during this period. The U.S. government began to pay serious attention to the mining district in 1807 when designated lead-bearing lands were turned over to the Ordnance Department of the government. Refined lead ore from the upper Mississippi River mines was in great demand in the building trades, It was used to produce shot for warfare, as well as to make pewter, fine glassware, enamel work, paints, pipes, joints, and medicines. Today, it remains an internationally traded commodity, the majority of which is used in car batteries. Laws governing how the United States government was going to be paid by miners and smelters for their lead leases were continually refined but unevenly enforced. The U.S. government did not allow public sale and ownership of the mineral land until 1847, when their lead mine leasing scheme proved to be unmanageable. This document is actually quite amazing. It gives a summary of those who owned leases since 1821. The leases were only being given out since about 1819. So we have all the names of every person who was given a lease and what they paid. And it's really, I know it's hard to see on your screen, but again, documents are the heart of history, and I'm very grateful to have run into lots of great documents. In 1804, the same year that the United States actually took possession of the Louisiana Purchase lands, a largely contested treaty was offered to ineligible tribal leaders. Known as the First Treaty of St. Louis, it was initiated by William Henry Harrison, then the governor of the Indiana Territory. According to the official White House website, quote, his prime task as governor was to obtain title to Indian lands so settlers could press forward into the wilderness. When the Indians retaliated, Harrison was responsible for defending the settlements. That's on the website for the government, so at least they knew what he was doing. They know what he's doing. They know now what he was doing anyway. The treaty was signed by 4 Sauk Indians and 1 Muskogee, who in fact had no authority to speak for their nations regarding land treaties. The treaty terms ceded over 50 million acres of Sauk and Muskogee tribal lands in Illinois, southwest Wisconsin, and northeastern Missouri, and the yellow portion helps you out with that. The payment received in exchange for the cession was $2,234.50. I think that was a penny on every 2 acres. And then there was a $1,000 annuity per year that was going to be paid to the tribes, supposedly in perpetuity. This was a massive and largely fraudulent land grab of 51 million acres. According to historian William Freeling, quote, Harrison and his aides warmly received 5 minor chiefs, softened them up with alcohol, then persuaded them to sign away 1/3 of modern Illinois, as well as sizable chunks of Wisconsin and Missouri, for 1 penny, as I said, per 200 acres. The Sauk representatives were not at liberty to negotiate these treaties, and Harrison knew that. In his biography, Blackhawk recalled that Quashquami and several others were sent to St. Louis to try and free a prisoner who had killed an American. Actually, that prisoner killed 3 Americans, but Blackhawk didn't want to boast. Upon their return, Quashquami said to Blackhawk, on our arrival at St. Louis, the American chief told us he wanted land. We agreed to give him some of the west side of the Mississippi, likewise more on the Illinois side, opposite the Salt River. Blackhawk commented in his memoir that it subsequently appeared that they had been drunk the greater part of the time while at St. Louis. I will leave it to the people of the United States to say whether our nation was properly represented in this treaty, or whether we received a fair compensation for the extent of country ceded by these individuals. He could be starchy, that Blackhawk. While farming, fur trading, and hunting were their main occupations, Indians continued to use their mines and smelters on both sides of the Mississippi River, where they traded with the French and British the refined ore for goods that they desired. It is said that in 1810, despite using very crude smelting methods and not digging very deep, the local Indians produced 400,000 pounds of lead in that year alone. Blackhawk remembered lead mining as an occupation for the women of the tribe, as well as for the older men. It was part of the seasonal rotation of work done, as he explained, when the corn was knee-high. The women, children, and older men would go north to the lead mines from their village at Saginaw, which is at Rock Island, Illinois, while the younger men would go in the direction towards sundown, I'm guessing that's west, to hunt deer and buffalo. After the 40 days, all would return to the village. In addition to the Dubuque site, by the early 1800s, a local Muskogee leader known as the Buck was operating a large lead mine just north of present-day Galena, Illinois. So just to orient us, here's Prairie Sheen. This is where I live in Platteville. That's a lead mining town. Got Dubuque, Iowa here, where we were talking about the mines of Spain. We've got Galena here, which becomes the southern entrepot of the lead mine district. And then, of course, there's lead mines all through this area. All through this area. A huge number. So now we have a community developing around Galena, Illinois. The Buck Mine, this Muskogee mine, was so extensive that it was commented upon by U.S. Indian agent Nicholas Boulevin in February of 1810. The Muskogee were raising so much lead from the mine and nearby diggings that a small cluster of trading posts sprouted out at the present site of Galena. These mostly métis traders and their families, who had cultural and familiar ties to the Muskogee, exchanged smelted lead for manufactured goods such as cloth, guns, and tools. It was at the Buck Mine that a mass of galena was found so large that it took the entire Muskogee band to raise it out of the ore-bearing crevice. It is estimated that while in possession of the mine, Buck's band removed somewhere between 3 to 10 million pounds of lead ore for the trade. It's impressive. In 1810, 20 Indian-tended lead furnaces were in operation near Galena, Illinois. By 5 years later, by 1820, the Americans were determined to force native landholders to allow them into the district. The realization of the rich deposits of lead in the area caused further clashes over questions of land ownership and use, leading to skirmishes, killings, and a mustering of a militia to contain the Indians. I show you this because it's really cool. So this is the kind of thing that early miners were finding. Crevices in limestone is quite normal. Limestone is quite porous, you probably know. That's the stone that's around where we live, in the lead mine district. And you get these cracks and crevices. And literally in the early days of the lead mine district, people would go into these caves and just scrape the stuff right off, just pull it right off the floor. Because it's heavy, it would drop off the ceiling, while other minerals and the rock around it would stay intact, so it would fall to the ground. They're literally picking up lead ore, not mining it in the beginning. So it's, yeah, a story that goes over a few hundred years, so lots of development over time. A turning point in this simmering contest came when Colonel Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky, supposed killer of Tecumseh at the Battle of Thames in 1813, and his brother Colonel James Johnson were briefly in Galena in 1819 and 1820, and they laid claim with government backing to that Buck mine I was talking about. In those days, people were using very crude constructed early lead mine smelting pits, and over in Mineral Point on the mine hill there, they reconstructed one to show what it would be like to smelt lead ore in an early log furnace. And this is what it would look like. And I was giving a talk several years ago to a group who wanted to see that because it's such a neat site. So you can go to Mineral Point and see all kinds of fun stuff. So now the Johnson brothers want to claim Buck's lead, or lead mine. They were called leads, which is confusing because it's spelled like lead, right? So a vein of lead is called a lead of lead. I know, this is, why am I studying this? There's other things I could be doing with my time. When Muskogee leaders heard about the intrusion on their land claim, and that the intrusion was by none other than the Indian fighting Johnson brothers, they induced their brothers to join them in protest of white transgression on their lead mining. Appeals for help to Thomas Forsyth, the newly appointed government agent posted at Galena, failed as Forsyth upheld the validity of the disputed 1804 treaty that was supposedly ceded all that Saukowasaki land to the U.S. government. Soon, Richard Johnson returned to Kentucky, where he resumed his political career, becoming the Vice President of the United States in the Van Buren administration. James Johnson went back to Kentucky to gather tools and supplies and several of his enslaved black workers, and he returned to the lead district to build the Johnson furnace where the Galena levee now stands. If you've ever been there, that's right on the Galena River there. It's called the Fever River in Wisconsin and the Galena in Illinois. So to ensure his success, he used his political clout with his brother to get an order from the Secretary of War to deploy troops from from Fort Edwards, Fort Armstrong, and Fort Crawford, 3 regional military forts owned by the U.S. government. Without the troops, the white miners didn't stand a chance of taking over the mines. In a good faith gesture, Johnson paid Old Buck and his people the equivalent of $300 in goods. Daniel Smith Harris, having arrived at Galena in 1823 as a youth, recalled that there were about 200 native people in the area and that wigwams dotted the hillsides and ravines around Galena. With a government land agent right on the scene in Galena and later in Mineral Point, miners and smelters were obliged to apply for leases, pay fees, and follow strict guidelines. Along with government oversight came a throng of fortune seekers, entrepreneurs, and land speculators, which advanced the first big wave of immigration into Wisconsin. The early mixed economy, which included the Indian fur trade, trade in manufactured goods and foodstuffs prepared by Indians, along with lead ore, quickly faded as military and white miners pushed their way in. While Chicago was little more than a military fort occupied by only a couple hundred villagers surrounded by Native American lands, the lead mine district incoming white population in 1828 was estimated to be 10,000. This is that map, the Chandler Map. Again, another amazing resource for the lead mine district. The Chandler Map was done in Galena. It was supposed to assess what is going on there in 1828. It was published in 1829 for the government. And it shows every tavern, every field, every lead mine, every old lead mine, every Indian village. It's a fabulous document that gives us insight into the region in that snapshot of 1828. So if you're interested in this topic, go online, you can find this map easily. It's called the Chandler Map, and it's of the lead mine district. So this area it was just a boom area. This total number of people, this 10,000 people that Chandler counted, did not count Native Americans or African descended peoples, just white people. It's clear the region was experiencing a real boom phenomenon as the mining and smelting of lead ore could be quite lucrative. The international market for lead was ever growing as it was used, as I said, in pottery glazes, masonry joining, roofing, glass production, plumbing. It had many uses. Beside the never-ending warfare in Europe and the Americas, lead was in demand. For the incoming miners in the early period of the lead mining boom, the living conditions could be very poor. Moses Meeker, an early lead miner, related that the men at the mining camps had only spoiled foods. In the 1820s, they were living on, quote, sour flour and condemned army pork, which produced a number of cases of scurvy, and some of them quite severe. 2 of them have lost the use of their legs. Other sources tell of outbreaks of dysentery resulting in many deaths. So I'm standing there in front of what I call a badger hut. I've done quite a study with my husband Jeff of these buildings that are around the lead mine district. They're sitting in backfields, and our friend here, John Devereaux, took that photo, and many others. And I just published an article about that in an Illinois journal. But it tells you about these housing huts that are still dotting the landscape of the lead mine district. It's a very interesting place. From the 1820s on, Southerners, mostly from southern Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri, used the Mississippi waterway to reach the lead mine district. The Illinois miners were derogatorily known as suckers because, like the sucker fish, they went upstream in spring and returned south in the fall. In retaliation, the Illinois miners called the Missourians pukes as they believed that Missouri had taken a puke and had vomited forth to the upper lead mines all of her worst population. With some southern miners came a number of African Americans brought to the lead mine district as slaves or indentured servants. Our memoirist, Daniel Smith Harris again, recalled that about 100 to 150 blacks were in the area in the 1830s. The government policy that slavery was illegal in the Northwest Territories, as you might recall, was enshrined in the 1787 Ordinance for the Northwest Territory. This law was further stated in the 1820 Missouri Compromise when Illinois and the Michigan Territory, the governmental body overseeing the future Wisconsin, were clearly designated as slave-free states. But slave owners shrugged their shoulders and lived life as they saw fit. The 1830 census for Joe Davis County, Illinois, recorded 29 enslaved and 31 free blacks. This number is undoubtedly lower than the actual one, because almost 10% of the white population in that county stated in the census that a black person lived on their homestead. Many sources point to illegal slavery and indentured servitude as ongoing institutions in the lead mine district through the 1840s, when it's finally banished altogether. I'm following out Henry Dodge and writing a book about him. He was the first territorial governor of Wisconsin. I know you've all heard of him. So I was looking at Dodge's census records. In 1840, he has 6 what he claims are free black persons. And in fact, they probably were free at that point. He did manumit them in the 1830s. And we have the manumission papers in Platteville at the Wisconsin Historical Society Research Center. But the folks are still there, all 6 of the people he had previously enslaved. Another group of Anglo-American migrants who arrived to the lead mine district were from the eastern states. They were reading in their newspapers about the rich lead ore deposits, the so-called gray gold. Easterners left by way of the Ohio River Valley proceeded north of the Mississippi and arrived by keelboat or later by 1820s a steam-powered packet. The Easterners generally made permanent moves, bringing all of their possessions and families with them to the lead mine district. The massive influx of immigrants to the region and loose government oversight caused clashes, leading to violence in the district. Suddenly, thousands of white miners were digging sucker holes all around the upper Mississippi lead mine district, and they were slipping into caves looking for easy-to-obtain lead ore. They were moving northward into Ho-Chunk mining and farming territory, and they were not welcome. Perhaps the best example of the increasing power and aggression of incoming miners is embodied in Henry Dodge, the future territorial governor of Wisconsin. He left Missouri in 1827 with his family and 5 enslaved workers. Only a week before Dodge arrived at the port of Galena, Wanatsuchka, or Redbird, a Ho-Chunk warrior, with a few of his accomplices, had committed a heinous crime against a métis family who were living on Ho-Chunk land near Prairie du Chien. In this case, Redbird was compelled to cover the dead, as he believed 2 of his warriors had been killed at the hands of the American government. To cover the dead was a Native American practice of killing or kidnapping one of the enemy to replace tribal members who were enslaved or killed. Redbird's brutal attack, which caused the death of 2 men and the maiming of a baby, had the lead mine district on high alert for fear that more bloody attacks were soon to come. Miners and their families were in a panic, building fortifications around their cabin sites and leaving remote camps altogether for Galena or other populated areas. While waiting for the arrival of federal troops under the command of General Henry Atkinson, Dodge left his wife and family to the safety of Galena while he took command, organizing a local defense from Galena. To attain the honor of militia leader, however, he had to raise a larger group of supporters among the miners than a rival from Illinois, who was also an experienced militia leader. After a rowdy, drunken standoff, the miners chose Dodge to lead the campaign to get Redbird. He raised over 100 mounted volunteers to patrol the region from Prairie du Chien to Muscogee along the Wisconsin River, and then they continued northeast all the way to the Portage, right here. With him on his expedition were his 2 teenage sons, Henry and Augustus. That's Augustus Caesar Dodge, his son. Their goal was to capture the renegade Redbird and bring him to justice, but he was nowhere to be found. Father and sons, along with their militia squad, saw no battles during the summer of 1827, They rode for days under the summer sun, apparently ill-prepared with little food to sustain them. Redbird had managed to elude the ragtag militia for a full month. However, upon learning the news that Atkinson's federal troops had arrived at Prairie du Chien, Redbird chose to surrender. He wanted to avoid an all-out confrontation between the Ho-Chunk and the arriving U.S. military. He wanted to protect his people from devastating warfare. Dressed in his best white deer hide uniform, Redbird told his captors, quote, "I do not understand the white man's laws, which has one set of words for the white man and another for the red." He went on to say, "The white men promised us the lead mines would be ours, but they did nothing to put the men who came to take possession away from them. We have been patient. We have seen the ancient burial grounds plowed over. We have seen our braves shot down like dogs for stealing corn. We have seen our women mocked and raped. We have seen the white men steal our lands, our quarries, our forests, our waterways." Redbird concluded by saying, "I did no wrong. I am not ashamed. I am ready. Take me." Quickly making a name for himself and armed with his extensive military background, political experience, and willingness to use violence to get what he wanted, Dodge succeeded in Ho-Chunk territory where others had failed. Well aware that he was illegally trespassing, he paid Bear, a Ho-Chunk chieftain, in presents for the right to live and mine on their lands. His mining and smelting operations were near present-day Dodgeville, Wisconsin. Michigan Territorial Judge James Doty called on Dodge in late July 1827. He found cabins surrounded by a formidable stockade, and miners liberally supplied with ammunition. Between 50 and 130 armed miners lived at the camp. Dodge's stockade fort was near his largest mine, as were about 20 log homes. A double furnace for smelting ore was nearby. In January 1828, the Indian agent at Prairie du Chien, Joseph M. Street, aware of Dodge's trespassing and digging without a license, informed General William Clark, Superintendent of Indian Affairs at St. Louis. He said that at Dodge's diggings, they were raising up to 2,000 pounds of mineral a day and could smelt 50 bars of lead. Street was concerned that the chief named Bear might be happy with that arrangement, but other Ho-Chunk leaders were not. A chief named Karuma the Lame told the agent that the white miners were taking the lead that his group had been mining. He wanted the trespassers removed from his diggings. When confronted by a government agent, Dodge gathered his men and argued that since the area was contested between the Ho-Chunk, Chippewa, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, there really were no lines of clear demarcation. He further exposed his duplicity when he declared that until he knew for sure who claimed the land, he would not leave unless removed by a force stronger than his own. So much for the Ho-Chunk named Bear. Dodge was an adherent of the Jacksonian vision of America, one that elevated the common white man in voting rights, and who believed that Americans were destined to control America from sea to sea, not the Indian nations, and certainly not the Spanish, who still held all of the Southwest. Jackson rallied for Indian removal, which appears to have been Dodge's position as well. But the fact is, Indians simply weren't needed anymore to fulfill the ambitions of the incoming miners. The decade between 1821 and 1831 saw a substantial shift in the economy away from fur trading and toward industrial mining. The Creole villages moved away, taking their trading posts of Indian kin with them. The fur trade had moved far to the west and north. The wealth it brought to Indian nations was no longer within the reach of the local groups. When native miners did not sink mine shafts, but dug long, wide trenches with their hand tools, white miners were digging shafts and using blasting powder to break up rock levels. They used windlass and rope, and therefore were able to extract mineral from much deeper crevices. Local goods were still very much relied upon, but when the river wasn't iced up, steamboats brought supplies, foodstuffs, and Euro-American household goods from all over. Moreover, removing Indians and extinguishing their land claims in order for white miners to move in aligned with the racist rhetoric that was so common in that period. I guess I don't have time to tell you all about mining, right? Lead mining, that's a whole other topic. I'm talking about people right now. But this one on the left kind of shows a picture. This is from the Owen geology book from 1840. It shows how they had miners go down with one leg in a bucket. Maybe you've seen this trick. Go to any museum in the lead mine district and you'll see a bucket. And they'll explain that a guy would put his body in there and one leg out to kick the sides of the mine so that it wouldn't clang against the wall and make him deaf, right? Because these are very narrow shafts. So you go down in the bucket with one leg in, one leg out, and you go down to the bottom, the guys are waiting down there, and you use a windlass and a rope. This is actually a slag furnace that's in Dodgeville. It's been refurbished, and it kind of shows how it works. Again, can't take time to explain all of lead mining and smelting right now, but these things appear on the landscape very infrequently, but when they do, it's beautiful, right? That's a really cool building. It's industrial architecture. It's interesting. To me, anyway. The denouement, or the last ugly chapter, if you will, was the Blackhawk War. It was a seminal event for the Meskwaki, the Sauk, and the Ho-Chunk nations. The war itself is detailed in over a dozen books of publication, so we're not going to do that tonight. We also have an autobiography by the Sauk chief himself, detailing the bloody summer of 1832 in Illinois, Wisconsin. It was in sum a terrible and tragic war of annihilation, and contrary to humane treatment of enemy combatants. Blackhawk, whose Sauk name was Makatai Nishikiakiak, was born in 1767. His hereditary group had a long history of defiance of U.S. authority. He and his band deeply opposed the aforementioned fraudulent treaty of 1804. In 1829, the Secretary of War agreed with Illinois Governor Reynolds' request and ordered the Sauk and Meskwaki to vacate Illinois. So they're over by Rock Island, Illinois. They set up new Indian villages in Iowa. You know, go over there, you guys, you'll be happy. One faction of the tribe, led by Keokuk, readily agreed to leave their home in Saugatuck and remove to Iowa in exchange for food and supplies. Another group, including the Sauk warrior Blackhawk, however, he wanted to return to the village in Illinois, at Saugatuck near Rock Island. The refugees were given corn and foodstuffs in order to accept the reservation life in Iowa, but it turned out the corn was rotten. So Blackhawk's group was attempting to return to their planting fields, and they did that in 1831 and in 1832. The main motive for Blackhawks to defy U.S. government's orders was to ensure there'd be enough to eat during the long, harsh winter. Blackhawk quickly learned that his return to Illinois would be met with stiff and violent opposition. There would be no negotiations. Over 4 months, 1,000 men, women, and children attempted to outrun the hastily organized local militia groups that were led by none other than Henry Dodge. Dodge left no doubt about his intentions. In a letter to his commanding officer, he wrote, "Be assured that every possible exertion will be made to destroy the enemy, crippled as they must be with their wounded and families, as well as their want of provision and supplies." Skirmishes and bloodshed resulted until the last few hundred of Blackhawk's group were forced to swim across the Mississippi River, where they were mercilessly mowed down by gunfire. They had already been forced from their mines and their fields. Now they could never return to their villages and ancestral graveyards. The Ho-Chunk, who were nominally in support of Blackhawk, were also punished with unequal treaties, which divested them of lands that they had occupied for generations. On his brief return home, Dodge was greeted by elated Mineral District folks. They sang the following to the tune of Old Lang Syne. Shall I sing it or should I just say it?
Sing it.
You should sing it. Should savage warfare be forgot and ne'er again appear, with hands upon our bosom put, we'll say Dodge shall live here. He was the hero of the lead mine district and was rewarded with further national, military, and political appointments over the next 30 years. Another tragic outcome of this era was the destruction of the environment. To refine lead ore into a usable commodity requires smelting the galena at a high temperature to drive off the impurities. sulfur dioxide is released, which when in combination with water molecules creates acid rain. Acid rain pollutes farmland and is damaging, of course, to animals and humans. In addition, the tons of wood and later coal used to fire the hundreds of furnaces caused the air to be thick with particulate matter. When visitors came into areas with smelting furnaces, they commented on the stunted trees and the denuded landscapes. The health of the mining communities was sacrificed for the trade. Miners, smelters, painters, enamelers, glazers, typesetters, and other types of workers were identified as victims of colic, emaciation, anemia, wrist drop, and encephalopathy, from exposure to lead. Even today, decades since the mine's been closed, the streams in our lead mine district show high levels of lead and other heavy metals, not seen in other parts of Wisconsin. In conclusion, the lead mine district, tucked up in the unglaciated hills near the Mississippi River, was a quite diverse community of people with multilingual, racial, and cultural aspects. Before the American domination of the lead district, French Creole families lived in multiracial communities. This is evidenced by the fact that Registre Garnier, one of the unfortunate victims during the Redbird Uprising of 1827, was the son of a black woman and a white Frenchman. He in turn married a métis woman of French and Dakota ancestry. There were many such early families whose lineages were mixed, especially in French towns, such as Prairie du Chien and early Galena. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, they had what everybody else wanted. They had the lead. Their land was possessed of rich soil for farming, and nature provided this easy-to-obtain ore. In the land grab that ensued, they were pushed out by greed, racial animosity, and ultimately government policy and violent military force. Thank you. Any questions or thoughts or ideas? Yeah.
Geologically, why is there lead centered in this area?
That's still a little bit up for debate among geologists. It's thought that in primordial waters, hot water, you have these microscopic molecules of lead, and they can come up through karst, which is the landscape we have, which is because we have this very porous limestone as our rock base, if you will. It allows for these molecules over millions of years, hundreds of millions of years to form. So that's the theory that is being proposed right now. If you read older literature, there are many theories. It's very interesting to see the evolution of theory about that. But that seems to be, we're talking about something that happened in a primordial age and that allowed that lead ore to be quite at the surface. And limestone wears away quite easily compared to many other rocks. So you got this really hard rock, this really hard ore, lead, and other stuff's being whittled away by the rains and the seas and the storms, all the things that are going on. And this lead ore is just hanging there. So it's in sheets. Miners were finding it sort of in levels or sheets. So they'd go down, find a level, and then go that way. So we're talking about a lot of hard rock mining with blasting power and bear holes, they call them, little tiny crevices where guys are working who are shorter than me, in there with their pick and gad. It's quite the scene. Anybody else have something to say? I hope you do. Yeah.
I'll get another one. So why is it, though, I've always heard it was the Welsh who did the mining here in Wisconsin?
So a lot of people talk about the Cornish, which are South English miners. So they were really skilled miners. I have a thesis about that as well, of course, because I studied the lead mine district. My family's from the North British lead mine district, and they came to Galena in 1834. And there was a huge chain migration of people that came from that region. And they were super skilled too. They don't get much credit, but because it goes from Cornish. But both groups were like highly skilled. in mining because they had perfected it over generations. Whereas a lot of these guys who were showing up in Galena and Mineral Point and areas, you know, they've never mined in their lives. I mean, they were just looking for an opportunity. These people had a lot of knowledge. Some of them were engineers, had worked in mines all their lives. Their fathers and brothers had, you know, they had experience. So yes, there were some Welsh miners, but we really do talk about the Cornish. Mineral Point is considered a Cornish, you know, town. And they built different kinds of buildings. The Cornish are known for that beautiful dressed stone buildings that you see in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. So I like to talk about housing, what different kinds of housing were created by different kinds of people based on where they're from and what was on the landscape. So I showed you a badger hut. So that's like an early miner's housing, right? So, yes, definitely the Cornish, very important group. They came a little later though. You got the Southerners, the Easterners, then in terms of foreign-born, there's some Irish, but not too much mining, some mining with them. And then these North British came, and then the Cornish more in the 1840s. Just slightly later, 5-10 years later. Yeah.
Tell us a little more. You said you recently published a paper on the, the badger.
Oh, the badger huts?
dwellings. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fun topic. Kind of talk
So
about housing. Yeah.
what all is still remaining of that type?
We found about a dozen of them. There are probably more, and they're in various states of decay. We've been to badger huts where cows are standing on them, you know. So they're built into hillocks, so they're partially in subterranean soil, right? So they're not down like that, but they're built into a hillock so that they maintain a pretty constant temperature. Like I say, a lot of them are not in great shape anymore, but we have enough of them that we can see their shape. And there's lots of documentary evidence from many early folks coming in from the late 1820s through the 1840s, talking about these huts made of stone. So I read that, and I'm like, okay, well, I knew that my family had where the farm was, and I was told by a local that, see down here, this is a badger hut. I'm like, what? This is in Joe Davis County, north of Galena, right by the Wisconsin border. And this guy said, and on top they built a stone house, but they first had the badger hut. This was his theory, and I thought, well, we better look into that. So I looked into it, and actually this group helped me. John took most of the photos for my badger hut photos because he's a good photographer, and my husband Jeff here, and yeah, it's been a fun study. I'm kind of done with it because I published it now, and it's like, but I still talk about it if someone invites me to do that, because it is a fun topic. See, history's fun, right? It is. A lot of people don't know that. Other questions or thoughts, or, yeah, please.
I've got family from Key City area, around the edge, not Portage, but family lore says they found lead on their farm across from the St. Louis Cemetery. They still have property there. Are you familiar with any?
Sure. I mean, people are still finding lead around. I mean, sure.
I mean, this is in the 1860s.
Oh, so absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, spring comes and things get pushed up and we get little nuggets of lead. We still find lead ore. I mean, and then there's all this slag sitting around in piles all over the lead mine district. And it's highly toxic, so this isn't good. But it does mean that you can find out, you know, where these bigger operations were. Now, it really is the lead zinc mine district, but I don't really talk about zinc much because most of my study goes from 1650 to 1850. I don't do much with zinc, which really wasn't being mined, and it certainly wasn't processed because it's a much more complex process till about the 1890s, 1880s, and zinc became hugely important, especially during wars. We see big spikes in the local zinc trade. But yeah, the area where your family's from, that zinc mine, the New Jersey Zinc Mine Company, was all over that area. I'm hot and tired and want to go home. If you have another question or thought, please hit me up, otherwise we'll say night.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
We'll talk tonight, and then mark your calendars for second Tuesday in August. We'll be hearing about Aldo Leopold's use of history and understanding the landscape, so make sure to stop up for that too.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you guys all for coming.